On a night when the Wyoming wind screamed like something dying, Thomas Brennan woke to a sound that didn't belong to winter. Not the crack of ice-laden branches or the groan of his farmhouse settling under snow. This was different, rhythmic, desperate. The heavy thud of something alive striking his front door again and again, as if the frozen world itself had come begging. When he pulled back the bolt and opened that door into air so cold it seized his lungs, Tom found himself face to face with an apparition. A pale gray stallion, massive and spectral in the whirling snow, stood on his porch with steam pouring from its nostrils like dragon's breath, and collapsed at its hooves, barely visible against the white ground, lay a foal so still Tom thought at first it was already gone. What happened next would shatter the quiet grief Tom had wrapped around himself like armor, drag him into a battle he never wanted to fight, and force him to choose between the safety of silence and the terrible, beautiful risk of caring again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The cold had teeth that night, not the clean bite of autumn frost or even the sharp kiss of early winter, but something ancient and merciless that turned breath to ice in your chest and made your bones ache with a cold that went deeper than flesh. Whitewood County, Wyoming had seen hard winters before, the kind that buried fence posts and turned the Wind River Range into jagged white fangs against an iron sky. But this was different. The thermometer outside Tom Brennan's kitchen window had stopped at -30 °C hours ago, and the wind chill dragged it down to places where exposed skin froze in minutes and the world became a white howling void that swallowed sound and sense. Tom had gone to bed early that night, not because he was tired but because there was nothing else to do. The power had flickered twice already, threatening to leave him in the dark with only the wood stove for warmth, and he'd stoked it high before climbing the stairs to his bedroom. The farmhouse, built by his grandfather in 1947, groaned and settled around him like an old man easing into a chair, every timber and nail protesting the cold. He'd pulled the quilts up to his chin, quilts his wife and had stitched in the years before the cancer took her voice and then her breath, and he'd lain there listening to the wind assault the walls like an army that would never tire. Sleep came in fits the way it always did now. 3 years since and had died. 5 since Billy had been taken by pneumonia that started as nothing more than a cough after playing too long in the snow. Tom had learned to navigate the space between waking and sleeping, that gray territory where memories had sharper edges than daylight allowed. He'd learned to function on 4 hours of broken rest, learned to fill the silent rooms with the sound of work, learned to measure his days in tasks completed rather than moments lived. The farm had become both his prison and his purpose, 70 acres of frozen earth that demanded attention even when he had nothing left to give. The sound came just after 2 in the morning, pulling him from a dream he couldn't remember but left him with a feeling like falling. At first he thought it was the wind, some new trick of the storm that made it sound almost like knocking, but then it came again, deliberate, insistent, a heavy thud against wood, then another, each one separated by a breath of silence before the next impact. Tom sat up, the cold air of the bedroom hitting his face like a slap, and reached for the flannel shirt he'd draped over the bedpost. His hands shook slightly as he buttoned it, though whether from cold or something else he couldn't say. The sound continued as he descended the stairs, each step creaking under his weight, and he realized with a jolt that whatever was making that noise was at his front door. Not the back door that led to the mudroom and the barn beyond, but the front entrance that faced the long driveway and the county road a quarter-mile distant. Nothing came to the front door at 2 in the morning in a blizzard. Nothing human, anyway. Tom's mind went to the rifle in the hall closet, but something stopped him. The rhythm of the sound wasn't aggressive. It was pleading. He crossed the living room in darkness, unwilling to turn on lights that might die if the power finally gave up, and his hip caught the corner of the coffee table hard enough to make him grunt. The pain was sharp and immediate, and he welcomed it because it meant he was awake, that this wasn't some fever dream brought on by isolation and grief. The thuds continued, steady as a heartbeat, and Tom realized he could hear something else beneath them now. A sound like wind but not wind, a keening note that rose and fell with a cadence that made his chest tight. His hand found the deadbolt, cold enough to sting his palm, and he hesitated. Every practical instinct he'd honed over 52 years of life told him not to open that door, not to let the killing cold inside, not to face whatever impossible thing waited on the other side. But there was another instinct, older and deeper, the one that had made him volunteer for search and rescue in his 30s, the one that had driven him through blizzards to find lost hikers and hunters who'd wandered too far from camp. The instinct that said, when something calls for help, you answer. The bolt slid back with a metallic click that seemed too loud, and Tom pulled the door inward. The wind hit him like a fist, driving snow into his face and stealing his breath, and for a moment he couldn't see anything but white chaos. Then the wind shifted, just for an instant, and the porch light that had somehow stayed on illuminated a scene Tom's mind struggled to process. A horse stood on his wooden porch, not at the bottom of the steps but on the boards themselves, so close that if Tom had reached out he could have touched its frost-covered muzzle. The animal was enormous, taller at the shoulder than any saddle horse Tom had ever worked with, its coat a pale gray that made it look like something carved from dirty snow and given life. Icicles hung from its mane and forelock, and its eyes, God, its eyes were the darkest brown Tom had ever seen, almost black, and they held an intelligence and desperation that hit him harder than the cold. But it was what lay at the horse's feet that stopped Tom's heart. A foal, small and dark and impossibly fragile, lay crumpled on the snow-dusted porch like a bundle of rags someone had discarded. At first Tom thought it was dead, its body so still and its coat so encrusted with ice that it looked more like a statue than a living thing. Then he saw it. The smallest movement, barely perceptible, as the foal's ribs expanded and contracted in a breath so shallow it might have been imagination. Tom's mouth opened but no sound came out. His brain raced to make sense of what he was seeing, to fit it into some framework of normal experience, but there was nothing normal about this. Wild horses existed in the foothills, everyone knew that, small bands that had escaped from ranches over the decades and learned to survive in the high country. But they didn't come to houses. They didn't climb onto porches. They didn't stand in killing cold and beg. Yet that's exactly what this horse was doing. The great gray head lowered, and the stallion, Tom was certain now it was male from the thick crest of the neck and the powerful shoulders, made a sound low in its throat. Not a whinny or a neigh but something more primal, a rumble that Tom felt in his sternum more than heard with his ears. The horse's gaze moved from Tom to the foal and back again, and the message was so clear it might as well have been spoken in English. Help, please, help. Tom's hands were shaking now, not from cold though his bare feet were already numb on the threshold, but from the weight of what was being asked of him. He'd spent 3 years building walls around his heart, brick by careful brick, constructing a fortress where nothing could hurt him because nothing could reach him. He'd told himself it was survival, that a man could only take so much loss before he had to stop letting the world in. He'd convinced himself that the farm was enough, that the cattle and the chickens and the endless work of keeping a property running were sufficient purpose for whatever years he had left. Now here was this horse, this impossible ghost-colored stallion, asking him to tear down those walls, asking him to care about something fragile and probably dying, something that would almost certainly break his heart all over again. Every logical bone in Tom's body screamed at him to close the door, to go back to bed, to let nature take its course the way nature always did. The foal was likely too far gone anyway. He wasn't a vet. He had no special equipment, no training in equine medicine beyond basic ranch first aid. What could he possibly do that would make a difference? But he couldn't close the door. He stood there in the threshold with the wind trying to tear the door from his grip and the cold burning his feet, and he looked at that foal, really looked at it and saw Billy. Not literally, of course. Billy had been a boy, not a horse, had died in a hospital bed surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed, not on a frozen porch in the middle of nowhere. But the helplessness was the same. The fragility, the sense of time running out like sand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Through fingers that couldn't grip tight enough to hold it. Tom had failed Billy. He'd thought it was just a cold, had told and they should wait a day before calling the doctor, had said boys get sick and boys get better and there was no need to overreact. By the time the fever spiked and Billy's breathing turned ragged, By the time they'd made the frantic drive to the hospital in Riverside with their son's small body burning like a coal in the back seat, it was too late. Pneumonia, the doctor had said. Aggressive. If you'd brought him in yesterday, maybe. That maybe had lived in Tom's chest for 5 years like a stone, getting heavier with each passing season. He'd carried it to Anne's bedside when the cancer came, had felt it pressing down when she'd looked at him with those pain-dulled eyes and asked him to take care of himself after she was gone. He'd carried it to both their graves, the matching headstones in the cemetery on the hill overlooking town, and he'd promised himself he would never, ever have to carry another maybe. Never again would he be too late, too slow, too paralyzed by doubt to act when action might save a life. The decision made itself. Tom stepped back from the doorway and heard his own voice, rough from disuse and cold, say words that surprised him even as they left his mouth. All right, come on. Let's get him inside. He had no idea if the horse could understand, no rational expectation that a wild animal would respond to human direction, but he moved anyway. He pulled the door wider, creating a gap large enough for a man to pass through, and then he did something that would have seemed insane an hour ago. He stepped out onto the porch in his bare feet and moved toward the foal. The stallion watched him come with those unfathomable dark eyes, and Tom expected at any moment to feel hooves strike his chest or teeth close on his shoulder. Wild horses were dangerous. Everyone knew that, unpredictable and powerful enough to kill a man without meaning to. But the great gray head remained still, nostrils flaring as Tom knelt beside the foal, and when Tom reached out to touch the small body, the horse didn't move. Tom's fingers found fur stiff with ice and beneath its skin so cold it felt like touching marble. The foal was a colt. He could see that now. Dark bay with a coat that would be glossy and beautiful if it wasn't currently crusted with frost. One ear twitched as Tom's hand made contact. A tiny movement that sent a surge of something Tom hadn't felt in years flooding through his veins. Hope. Terrible, fragile, dangerous hope. He'd need to move fast. The foal was deep into hypothermia, probably had been for hours given how thoroughly frozen it was, and every second counted. Tom slid his arms under the small body, feeling the sharp angles of ribs and the delicate architecture of legs that seemed impossibly thin, and lifted. The colt weighed perhaps 80 pounds, light enough that Tom could carry him but heavy enough that his back protested as he straightened. The cold was vicious now, biting through his thin clothing and turning his feet into blocks of ice, and he moved as quickly as he dared toward the open door. The stallion followed. Tom heard the heavy hooves on the porch boards behind him, felt the presence of something massive and powerful at his back, and his lizard brain screamed at him to run. But he didn't run. He stepped through the doorway into the blessed warmth of the farmhouse, and the horse came with him. Just to the threshold, not into the room itself, but close enough that when Tom turned after laying the foal on the rug in front of the wood stove, he found himself face to face with the stallion again. This close, in the light, Tom could see details he'd missed outside. The scars on the animal's shoulders and flanks, the way one ear had a notch taken out of it, the sheer size of the head that was as long as Tom's torso. This was not some pampered ranch horse gone feral. This was something that had survived in the wild, had fought and endured and learned to live where comfort was a memory. "I've got him," Tom said, and the words felt like a vow. "I'll do what I can. Promise." The stallion held his gaze for a long moment, and Tom had the unsettling sense that he was being measured, evaluated, judged by a consciousness that was alien but no less real for being housed in an animal's brain. Then the great head lowered in what might have been a nod, and the horse backed away from the door. Tom pushed it closed against the wind and through the deadbolt, and, when he looked out the window beside the door, the stallion was still there. Standing in the storm, facing the house, visible only as a pale shape in the swirling white. Waiting, watching, keeping vigil. The foal lay on the braided rug like something discarded by a careless god, its small body radiating cold so intense that Tom could feel it through his jeans when he knelt beside it. The wood stove threw heat into the room with the steady crackle of burning pine, but it seemed to make no impression on the ice-crusted creature at his feet. Tom's mind raced through everything he knew about hypothermia, knowledge gleaned from years of search and rescue training that suddenly felt inadequate to the task before him. He'd pulled lost hikers from snowbanks, had wrapped shivering hunters in thermal blankets, and forced hot liquids down their throats until their core temperature climbed back from dangerous lows. But those had been humans, and he'd always had his team around him. Radios crackling with instructions from base camp, medical supplies in organized packs. Now he was alone with a dying animal and nothing but his own failing memory to guide him. The first rule came back to him through the fog of panic that threatened to cloud his thinking. Don't warm too quickly. Rapid rewarming could send cold blood from the extremities rushing back to the heart and cause cardiac arrest. Tom forced himself to stand, forced his frozen feet to carry him to the linen closet in the hallway, where Anne's quilts still sat folded and smelling faintly of lavender from the sachets she'd tucked between them. His hands trembled as he pulled down two of the heaviest, and for a moment he stood there clutching them to his chest, remembering Anne's hands stitching the patterns by lamplight in the evenings after Billy had gone to bed. She'd made them as an act of love, something to keep her family warm through Wyoming winters, and now they would serve that purpose in a way she'd never imagined. He carried the quilts back to the living room and found the foal exactly as he'd left it, utterly still except for the barely perceptible rise and fall of its ribcage. Tom spread the first quilt on the floor beside the colt and carefully, gently, rolled the small body onto it. The ice in the foal's coat crackled and broke, falling away in small shards that caught the firelight like broken glass. Beneath the ice, the fur was matted and dull, pressed flat against skin that felt like cold leather under Tom's exploring fingers. He wrapped the quilt around the colt loosely, creating insulation without compression, then laid the second quilt over top. Only the small head remained visible, dark eyes closed, nostrils barely moving with each shallow breath. Tom sat back on his heels and tried to think. The foal needed fluids, that much he knew. Dehydration was as dangerous as the cold, maybe more so, and there was no way to know how long the colt had been without water or its mother's milk. But how did you give fluids to an unconscious horse? He couldn't exactly pour water down its throat without risking drowning it, and he had no for equipment even if he'd known how to insert a line into a vein he couldn't find. His eyes fell on the kitchen, visible through the wide doorway that separated it from the living room, and an idea began to form. He went to the pantry and found what he was looking for on the second shelf. A jar of honey, locally made, purchased at the farmer's market in Riverside back when he still went into town for things other than feed and supplies. He'd bought it because Anne had always kept honey in the house, said it was good for sore throats and sweetening tea, and after she died Tom had continued the habit without really knowing why. Now he was grateful for the impulse. Honey was concentrated energy, simple sugars that could be absorbed even by a compromised system, and it might be enough to give the foal's failing body something to burn. He filled a shallow bowl with warm water from the tap, tested the temperature with his finger to make sure it wasn't hot enough to burn, then stirred in a generous spoonful of honey until it dissolved into a golden swirl. He carried the bowl carefully back to the living room and knelt beside the foal again, setting the bowl on the floor within easy reach. The colt's muzzle was cold and dry when Tom touched it, the lips slack, and he felt his heart sink. Getting an unconscious animal to drink was going to be harder than he'd thought. He dipped his finger in the honey water and brought it to the foal's lips, letting a drop fall onto the tongue. Nothing happened. The liquid just sat there, pooling in the small mouth, and Tom watched it with mounting desperation. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, little one. Try. Please try." He repeated the process, another drop, then another, each one placed carefully on the tongue in the hope that instinct would trigger a swallow reflex. Still nothing. The drops accumulated, threatening to spill out of the mouth entirely, and Tom was about to give up when he saw it. A tiny movement in the throat, barely visible beneath the matted fur. The foal had swallowed. The relief that flooded through Tom was so intense it made him dizzy. He waited a moment, letting the Colt system process that first small victory, then offered another drop. This time the swallow came quicker, and Tom allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to end the way every part of his experience told him it would. He settled into a rhythm, dipping his finger, offering liquid, waiting for the swallow. It was painstaking work, each drop representing perhaps a teaspoon of fluid, nowhere near enough to rehydrate a severely dehydrated animal, But it was something. It was action where before there had been only helplessness. The wind outside continued its assault on the farmhouse, rattling windows and howling down the chimney with a voice that sounded almost human. Tom glanced toward the front window and saw that the pale shape of the stallion was still there, a ghost in the storm. The horse hadn't moved, hadn't sought shelter in the barn or the equipment shed or any of the other structures on the property. It simply stood in the killing cold, facing the house, and Tom understood that the animal would stand there until the foal either lived or died. The weight of that vigil pressed down on him, adding to the burden he already carried. 2 lives now depended on what he did in the next hours, and he couldn't afford to fail either of them. Time became elastic in the way it always did during a crisis, stretching and compressing until Tom lost track of whether he'd been kneeling on the floor for minutes or hours. His knees ached, his back screamed protest at the sustained awkward position, and his feet had progressed from numb to painful as circulation returned to flesh that had been too cold for too long. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Each drop of honey water was a promise kept, a tiny defiance against the entropy that wanted to drag this fragile life down into darkness. The foal's breathing changed sometime during that vigil. Tom noticed it gradually, the way you notice dawn arriving not as a single moment but as a slow lightening of the sky. The breaths came slightly less shallow, slightly more regular, and when Tom pressed his palm against the small ribcage, he thought he could feel a hint of warmth beginning to radiate from within. The quilts were doing their work, creating a pocket of insulation that allowed the colt's own metabolism to begin the slow process of generating heat. It wasn't much, not nearly enough to declare victory, but it was movement in the right direction. Tom's mind drifted as he worked, pulling up memories he usually kept locked away in rooms he didn't visit. Billy at 5 years old, insisting on helping with the evening chores despite being barely tall enough to reach the chicken coop latches. And laughing in the kitchen, flour dusted across her cheek like war paint as she rolled out pie dough. The 3 of them together on the porch in summer twilight, watching the sun paint the Wind River Range in shades of orange and gold while the first stars emerged in the darkening east. Happy memories, painful in their sharpness, and Tom had learned not to indulge them because they led inevitably to the other memories. Billy's labored breathing in the hospital, Anne's hand growing cold in his as the cancer finally won its war. The double funeral that had taken place on a spring day so beautiful it felt like mockery. He'd thought after and died that he was done with caring, done with hoping, done with letting anything or anyone close enough to hurt him when they inevitably left because everything left. Death was patient and thorough, and it took everything you loved if you gave it enough time. Tom had decided to simply stop giving death targets. The cattle were livestock, economic units that he could sell or slaughter without emotional attachment. The chickens were egg producers, nothing more. The land itself was just dirt and grass and rocks that required management. He'd thought he'd successfully excised the part of himself that formed bonds, that looked at another living thing and saw something worth protecting rather than just something that would eventually become another source of pain. Now here he was with his finger in a bowl of honey water, trying to save a foal that by all rights should already be dead, and feeling things he'd promised himself he'd never feel again. Fear that his efforts wouldn't be enough. Hope that maybe this time they would. A desperate, aching need for this small creature to survive that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the gaping hole in his chest where his son used to live. Tom recognized the dangerous territory he was entering and couldn't seem to stop himself from walking straight into it. The first hints of dawn were graying the windows when the foal's eyes opened. Tom had been staring at nothing, his mind gone fuzzy with exhaustion, when he felt rather than saw the change in the small body beneath his hand. He looked down and found himself meeting a gaze that was clouded with weakness but undeniably aware. The colt's eyes were dark brown, almost black, and for a heartbeat Tom saw intelligence there, a consciousness that recognized him as something other than just another piece of the environment. The moment stretched between them, human and animal, and Tom felt something shift in his chest, a wall cracking that he'd thought was solid. "Hey there," Tom whispered, his voice rough from disuse and emotion. "Hey little one, you're okay. You're safe now." The words felt inadequate, too simple for the magnitude of what was happening, but they were all he had. The foal blinked slowly, exhaustion evident in every line of its small body. Then its eyes slid closed again. But the quality of unconsciousness had changed. Before it had been the slack absence of someone hovering at death's threshold. Now it looked more like sleep, the body's natural response to trauma and the enormous effort of healing. Tom carefully withdrew his hand and sat back, feeling every joint in his body protest. His watch told him it was nearly 5 in the morning. He'd been working over the foal for almost 3 hours, and the realization brought with it a wave of fatigue so intense he swayed where he sat. But there was no time to rest. The colt had made it through the immediate crisis, but it was far from stable. It needed real medical attention, someone who knew what they were doing, and Tom knew exactly one person in Whitewood County who fit that description. He pushed himself to his feet with a grunt that would have embarrassed him if there'd been anyone around to hear it, and made his way to the kitchen where his cell phone sat charging on the counter. The screen showed 3 bars of signal, a minor miracle given the storm that was still raging outside, and Tom scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. Dr. Rebecca Walsh. He'd met her exactly once, at the feed store in Riverside about 6 months ago, a chance encounter while they were both waiting for orders to be loaded. She'd been new to the area then, had just opened a veterinary practice on Main Street, and they'd exchanged the kind of pleasantries strangers make while trapped together by circumstance. Tom had noted her number in his phone thinking he might need a vet for the cattle someday, and now he was pathetically grateful for that moment of foresight. His thumb hovered over the call button. It was 5 in the morning. He'd be waking her from sleep, dragging her out into a storm that was bad enough to make travel dangerous, asking her to come to his isolated farm for an emergency that wasn't even his animal. She'd be well within her rights to tell him to bring the foal to her clinic, or to wait until normal business hours, or simply to refuse altogether. But Tom thought about the colt lying on his living room floor, thought about the stallion standing vigil in killing cold, and pressed the button. The phone rang 4 times, and Tom was preparing himself for voicemail when the line clicked open and a woman's voice, thick with sleep, said hello? Dr. Walsh, Tom said, and his voice cracked on the words. This is Thomas Brennan. We met at the feed store a while back. I'm sorry to call so early, but I need help. There was a pause, and he could hear the rustle of bedding as she presumably sat up. What's wrong? Her voice was clearer now, taking on the professional tone of someone used to emergency calls. Do you have an injured animal? Tom looked back toward the living room where he could just see the edge of the quilts covering the foal. A wild horse brought its colt to my door tonight. Hypothermia, malnutrition, I don't know what else. I've been trying to warm it up and get fluids in, but I'm in over my head. The colt needs a real vet. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Tom thought the call had dropped. Then Dr. Walsh said, slowly, as if trying to make sure she'd heard correctly, a wild horse brought you. This foal. Yes, ma'am. Big gray stallion. Maybe 17 hands. Stood on my porch and wouldn't leave until I took the colt inside. Another pause. How bad is the foal? Bad. Tom felt his throat tighten. It was nearly frozen solid when I found it. I've got it wrapped up and I've been giving it honey water, but that's all I know to do. I think it's stabilizing, but I can't be sure. I need someone who knows what they're looking at. All right, Dr. Walsh said, and Tom heard decisive movement in the background. I'm coming. It'll take me a while in this storm, but I'm coming. Give me your address. Tom rattled off the directions, the turns and landmarks that would guide her from Riverside to his farm, and she repeated them back to confirm. When she hung up, Tom stood in his kitchen holding the phone and feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not quite relief because the danger was far from over, but maybe the loosening of a burden he'd been carrying alone. He made coffee because his body was demanding it and because he needed something to do with his hands while he waited. The familiar ritual of grinding beans and measuring water gave him something to focus on besides the foal and the stallion and the growing certainty that his carefully constructed solitude was about to be shattered. Dr. Walsh would come, would see the colt, would ask questions about how it ended up in his house. Word would spread the way it always did in small communities. People would have opinions. Tom had lived quietly for 3 years specifically to avoid becoming the subject of other people's opinions, and now he was about to become the talk of Riverside whether he liked it or not. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, filling the kitchen with a smell that was comforting in its ordinariness. And Tom poured himself a cup that he doctored with cream and sugar, and had always teased him about his sweet tooth, said he drank coffee-flavored sugar rather than the other way around, and the memory made him smile despite everything. He carried the cup to the front window and looked out at the storm. The sky was lightening in the east, not true dawn yet but the promise of it, and in that gray pre-dawn light Tom could see the stallion more clearly. The horse hadn't moved, still stood facing the house, snow piling on its broad back, icicles lengthening in its mane. The sight made Tom's chest ache with something that might have been admiration or might have been grief or might have been both at once. What kind of desperation drove a wild animal to seek human help? What calculus of hope and fear had the stallion performed in its head to decide that the risk of approaching a human dwelling was worth the chance of saving its colt? Tom had spent years telling himself that animals were simpler than people, that they operated on instinct rather than emotion, that attributing human feelings to them was foolish anthropomorphizing. But looking at that horse standing in the storm, he couldn't maintain the fiction. That was love out there, raw and uncomplicated and willing to endure anything for the sake of another. It was the same love that had made Tom volunteer for search and rescue, the same love that had driven him through blizzards to find lost strangers, the same love he'd felt for Billy and had tried so hard to bury when they left him. He turned away from the window before the emotions churning in his chest could translate into the tears he'd forbidden himself since Anne's funeral. Men didn't cry, his father had taught him, at least not where anyone could see. Grief was private, pain was something you carried alone, and breaking down helped nobody. Tom had internalized those lessons so thoroughly they'd become part of his skeleton, and he held to them now even though every part of him wanted to collapse under the weight of 3 years of accumulated sorrow and this one impossible night. The foal was sleeping peacefully when Tom checked on it, the quilts rising and falling with increasingly steady breaths. He knelt and carefully unwrapped enough of the coverings to check the colt's legs and belly, looking for signs of frostbite or injury he might have missed in the initial crisis. The legs seemed intact, all 4 of them moving slightly as the foal shifted in sleep, and the belly was soft rather than distended, which he hoped meant no internal bleeding. The dark coat was starting to dry in patches, revealing a color that was deeper than he'd first thought, almost chocolate with hints of red that caught the firelight. A bay, he thought, or maybe a liver chestnut. Beautiful in the way young things were beautiful simply by virtue of being young and alive. Tom found himself thinking about names, which was dangerous because names implied relationship, implied that this was something more than a temporary situation. The foal would recover or it wouldn't, and either way it would return to the wild with its sire. There was no reason to name it, no point in forming that kind of attachment. But his mind did it anyway, sorting through possibilities. The dark coat made him think of embers in a dying fire, that deep glow that promised warmth even when the flames were gone. Ember. The name settled into place with a rightness that felt inevitable, and Tom sighed because he knew what it meant. He'd already lost the battle against caring. Had probably lost it the moment he'd opened the door and seen that desperate stallion standing in the storm. The sound of an engine fighting through snow brought Tom to the window just after 7. Dawn had fully arrived by then, though calling it dawn was generous given how the storm turned everything into varying shades of gray. Through the swirling white he could make out headlights, 2 bright points that wavered and disappeared and reappeared as a vehicle made its slow way up his driveway. Dr. Walsh had made good time considering the conditions, better than Tom had expected, and he felt a rush of gratitude mixed with anxiety about letting another person into the small world he'd created here. He watched as a dark blue truck with Riverside Veterinary Clinic painted on the door in white letters pulled to a stop near the porch. The headlights cut off and a figure emerged from the driver's side, bundled in a heavy parka with the hood pulled up against the wind. Dr. Walsh moved with purpose despite the knee-deep snow, pulling 2 large bags from the truck bed before making her way toward the house. Tom had the door open before she reached the steps, holding it wide against the wind's attempts to tear it from his grip. She came through in a blast of cold air and snow, stomping her boots on the mat and pushing back her hood to reveal a face that Tom remembered from their brief meeting at the feed store. She was younger than he'd first thought when they'd met, probably late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and gray eyes that immediately began scanning the room with professional assessment. "Where is he?" she said without preamble, and Tom gestured toward the living room. Dr. Walsh dropped her bags by the door and crossed the room in quick strides, kneeling beside the pile of quilts that covered Ember. She'd already pulled a stethoscope from her pocket before Tom finished following her, and her hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "May I?" she asked, though she was already lifting the edge of the quilt, and Tom nodded even though she wasn't looking at him. The examination was quiet and thorough. She listened to Ember's heart and lungs, checked his gums and the capillary refill in his mouth, ran her hands over his legs and body feeling for breaks or swelling. Tom stood a few feet away, suddenly feeling useless in his own house, watching this stranger handle the foal with a gentleness that somehow made his throat tight. When she finally sat back on her heels, her expression was unreadable. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning. What time did you find him? What condition was he in? What have you done since then?" Tom walked her through the night, from the sound that had woken him to the stallion on his porch to the hours spent coaxing honey water into an unconscious foal. She listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, and when he finished she was quiet for a long moment. "You saved his life," she said finally. The words were simple, but they hit Tom like a physical blow. "If you hadn't gotten him warm when you did, if you hadn't gotten fluids into him, he'd be dead. The hypothermia was severe enough that another hour would have been too late." Tom didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and Dr. Walsh turned her attention back to Ember. "He's not out of danger yet. His temperature is still low and he's severely dehydrated. I need to get an 4-line in him, get some warmed fluids and electrolytes into his system. He'll also need antibiotics. His immune system is going to be compromised after this kind of stress." She was already moving as she spoke, pulling supplies from one of her bags with practiced efficiency. Tom watched as she set up an 4-bag on a makeshift stand fashioned from a floor lamp, as she found a vein in Ember's neck on the first try and secured the catheter with careful tape. The foal barely stirred during the procedure, too exhausted to protest, and Tom found himself impressed by both the vet's skill and the colt's resilience. The fluid started to drip, a steady rhythm that Dr. Walsh monitored for a moment before adjusting the flow rate. She drew up a syringe full of clear liquid from a small bottle and injected it into the foreport. "Antibiotics," she explained without Tom asking. "Broad spectrum. We're covering for any infection he might have picked up, plus preventing pneumonia, which is a real risk after hypothermia." She prepared another injection, this one administered directly into muscle. "Vitamin B complex and selenium. He's going to need all the support we can give him." Tom watched her work and tried to imagine what this must look like from her perspective. A reclusive farmer she'd met once calling her out in a blizzard to treat a wild horse's foal that had mysteriously appeared on his doorstep. She hadn't questioned his story, hadn't expressed skepticism or disbelief, had simply shown up and gotten to work. That said something about her, though Tom wasn't sure what. Either she was the kind of person who took people at their word, or she was the kind who'd seen enough strange things in her career that a desperate stallion seeking help didn't seem impossible. "The sire is still outside," Dr. Walsh said, and it wasn't a question. Tom realized she must have seen the pale shape standing vigil as she drove up. "Yes, ma'am," Tom confirmed. "He hasn't moved since he brought the colt here." She sat back, her hands resting on her knees, and for the first time since arriving she really looked at Tom rather than at her patient. "That's remarkable. I've worked with horses my whole life and I've never heard of behavior like that. Wild animals don't seek out humans for help. They avoid us instinctively." Tom thought about the stallion's eyes, the desperate intelligence he'd seen there. "This one did," he said simply. Dr. Walsh nodded slowly, processing something, then stood and walked to the front window. Tom joined her, and together they looked out at the horse. In the growing daylight, it was possible to see more details. The scars Tom had noticed before were even more visible now. Long lines across the shoulders and flanks that spoke of fights or falls or the 1,000 dangers that came with living wild. The horse's head was still up, still alert, and even from inside the house Tom could see the tension in every line of the stallion's body. "He's magnificent," Dr. Walsh said quietly. "Look at the bone structure, the depth of chest. That's not some scrubby Mustang. There's draft breeding in him somewhere, maybe Percheron or Belgian. She paused, then added something that sounded like she was thinking out loud. I wonder if he was domestic once. If he remembers humans as something other than predators. The thought hadn't occurred to Tom, but it made sense. A completely wild horse wouldn't have the framework to understand that humans could help. But one that had been around people before, that had some memory of domestication, might make that desperate leap of logic when its colt was dying. What do we do about him? Tom asked. We can't just leave him standing out there. He'll freeze. Dr. Walsh shook her head. We probably can't get him inside, and I wouldn't recommend trying. He's allowing us to help his colt, but that doesn't mean he trusts us enough to be confined. Best thing we can do is make sure he has access to shelter and food. Do you have a barn? Tom nodded. Out back. 3 stalls, hay storage, water trough with a heater. I could leave the door open. Give him the option. That's good, Dr. Walsh said. Put out hay and water. He'll decide if he wants to use it. Right now he's focused on the foal, but once he's satisfied the colt is okay, he might accept shelter. Tom agreed and went to pull on his winter gear, the insulated coveralls and heavy boots and thick gloves that turned him into something that moved slowly and clumsily but could survive outside for more than a few minutes. The wind hit him like a wall when he stepped out the back door, driving snow into any gap in his clothing and making him squint against the brightness. The barn was only 50 yards from the house, but it felt like a mile in the storm. Tom fought his way through drifts that came up to his thighs in places, his bad hip protesting every step, and by the time he reached the barn door his lungs burned with cold air and effort. Inside it was marginally warmer, the body heat of the 4 cattle he kept for milk and meat taking the edge off the freeze. They looked at him with patient bovine eyes as he moved down the center aisle to the empty stalls at the far end. He forked hay into one of the stall mangers, generous piles of the good grass hay he'd put up last summer when the weather cooperated and the fields produced more than he'd expected. He checked the automatic waterer, made sure it was flowing and heated, then went to prop open the barn door. It was heavy, designed to withstand Wyoming wind, and it took all his strength to secure it in the open position. Snow immediately began to blow inside, but that couldn't be helped. If the stallion was going to accept shelter, it needed to see a clear path to the colt, needed to know it wasn't being trapped. The walk back to the house was slightly easier with the wind at his back, and Tom was breathing hard when he came through the door and began stripping off his frozen outer layers. Dr. Walsh was still kneeling by Ember, monitoring the 4, and she looked up when Tom came in. The fluid's going in well, she reported. His gum color is improving. I think we're winning. The words sent relief flooding through Tom's chest, a physical sensation like warmth spreading from his center outward. He hung his coat on the hook by the door and moved to stand by the wood stove, letting heat soak into his frozen core. Dr. Walsh stood and stretched, her back cracking audibly. I need to ask you something, she said, and her tone made Tom wary. What are you planning to do after he recovers? Tom had been avoiding that question since the moment he'd opened his door and found a miracle on his porch. The honest answer was that he had no idea. The practical answer was that Ember would go back to the wild with his sire as soon as he was strong enough. But Tom found he couldn't say either of those things because neither felt true. I don't know, he admitted. Dr. Walsh nodded as if she'd expected that answer. There's going to be complications, she said. Wild horses are protected under federal law, but there are also local regulations about keeping them. And then there's the practical side. That colt is going to need ongoing care, vaccines, hoof trimming, all the things domestic horses need. Can you provide that? The question wasn't challenging, just practical, but it highlighted all the ways Tom hadn't thought this through. He'd been so focused on keeping Ember alive through the night that he hadn't considered what came after. Now here was this vet asking him to think beyond the immediate crisis, to consider a future that extended past the next hour or day. Before Tom could formulate an answer, there was a sound from outside. Not loud, not dramatic, just a low rumbling call that carried through the walls of the house and seemed to vibrate in Tom's sternum. The stallion. Dr. Walsh moved to the window and Tom joined her, and what they saw made them both go still. The pale horse was moving, not away from the house but toward the barn. It moved slowly, head swinging to check its surroundings, muscles bunched and ready to bolt at any sign of threat. But it moved. "He's accepting shelter," Dr. Walsh whispered, as if speaking too loudly might spook the animal. Tom watched the stallion pause at the barn entrance, saw the moment of decision as the horse weighed fear against need, and then the pale shape disappeared into the darkness of the barn interior. Tom let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The horse had made a choice to trust, even if only a little, even if only because the cold was unbearable. Felt like progress. They returned to Ember, whose condition continued to improve incrementally. By mid-morning his temperature had climbed to within normal range and the forebag was half empty. Dr. Walsh changed it for a fresh one, this time adding what she said were additional nutrients and more concentrated electrolytes. "He's going to sleep most of today," she told Tom. "His body needs to focus all its energy on healing. Best thing we can do is keep him warm, keep the fluids going, and let him rest." Tom made coffee for both of them and they sat in the living room, an odd tableau of vigil keepers. Dr. Walsh asked questions about the farm, about how long Tom had lived here, about the cattle and the chickens and the garden he used to keep before and died. Tom answered with the bare minimum of information, not trying to be rude but not inviting deeper conversation. He'd gotten out of the habit of talking to people, of sharing anything beyond the surface pleasantries required for basic transactions, and he didn't know how to restart. If Dr. Walsh noticed his reticence, she didn't comment on it. Instead, she talked about her own story, filling the silence in a way that felt generous rather than intrusive. She'd grown up in Denver, she said, daughter of 2 lawyers who'd expected her to follow in their footsteps. But she'd always been more interested in animals than arguments, had spent her teenage years volunteering at rescue centers and riding stables, had chosen veterinary school over law school despite her parents' disappointment. She'd practiced in Denver for 10 years, building a successful clinic that specialized in equine medicine, and then everything had fallen apart. There was a case, she said, her voice careful and controlled. A valuable show horse, severe colic, emergency surgery required. I did everything right, followed every protocol, but sometimes everything right isn't enough. The horse died on the table and the owner sued. They claimed negligence, said I'd made mistakes even though 3 other vets reviewed the case and found no errors. Tom watched her face as she spoke and saw the pain there, the wound that hadn't fully healed. It went to trial, she continued. I won eventually, but by then my reputation was damaged. People whispered. Clients left. I found myself defending my competence in every interaction. So I sold the clinic and came here. Somewhere small where nobody knew my name or my history. Somewhere I could start over. Tom understood about wanting to start over, about running from whispers and memories. He found himself saying, I lost my wife 3 years ago. Cancer. And my son before that. Pneumonia. The words came out flat, stripped of emotion because that was the only way he could say them without breaking. Dr. Walsh met his eyes and he saw recognition there. Not pity, which he couldn't have tolerated, but understanding. The acknowledgement of one wounded person seeing another. I'm sorry, she said simply. And Tom nodded because there was nothing else to say to that. Loss was loss. You carried it or you didn't. You survived it or you didn't. He'd chosen survival, had chosen to keep breathing and moving and performing the tasks that constituted living even when living felt like something that happened to other people. Now here was Ember, breathing steadily under Anne's quilts. And here was the stallion accepting shelter in Tom's barn. And here was this vet who'd driven through a blizzard to help a stranger save a wild horse's colt. Maybe survival wasn't just about continuing. Maybe it was also about moments like this, small victories against entropy and death. The day wore on in a strange, suspended way. Dr. Walsh stayed, monitoring Ember's condition and changing the forebags when they ran low. Tom made sandwiches around noon that they ate in companionable silence, then went out to check on the cattle and see if the stallion was still in the barn. The pale horse had claimed the stall Tom had prepared, was standing hip-shot in the corner with hay scattered at his feet. The animal's head came up when Tom entered, ears pinning flat in warning, but it didn't bolt. Tom spoke softly, meaningless words of reassurance, and put out more hay before backing away. Small steps, that's how trust got built. Small steps repeated until they became a path. By evening, Ember was showing signs of real improvement. His eyes opened more frequently and stayed open longer. He shifted position on his own rather than remaining in the same exhausted sprawl. When Dr. Walsh offered him a bottle with diluted electrolyte solution, he latched on and sucked greedily, his small body remembering what to do even if he didn't have the strength yet to stand. Tom watched the colt drink and felt something in his chest that might have been joy or might have been terror. This small creature was going to live. Against all odds, despite the killing cold and the hours spent hovering at death's edge, Ember was going to make it. And Tom had no idea what that meant for his carefully reconstructed life. Dr. Walsh packed up her equipment as darkness fell outside, the storm finally beginning to ease. She'd need to get back to town, she said. But she'd return in the morning to check on Ember and change the four. Tom should keep him warm, offer fluids every few hours, watch for any changes in breathing or alertness. If anything seemed wrong, she was just a phone call away. Tom walked her to the door, helped her carry her bags to the truck through snow that was finally diminishing to flurries. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt inadequate for what she'd done. She dropped everything to help him save a wild animal, had spent her entire day in his house tending to a patient she'd never be able to bill for, and he had no way to repay that kind of generosity. Dr. Walsh smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "You did the hard part," she said. "You opened your door when that horse asked for help. Most people wouldn't have." She climbed into her truck and started the engine, letting it warm while she brushed snow off the windshield. Tom stood on the porch and watched her navigate back down the driveway, her taillights disappearing into the twilight, and then he was alone again. Alone except for a sleeping foal in his living room and a wild stallion in his barn, and the ghost of his wife whispering in his memory that caring was always worth the risk of pain. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Tom hadn't experienced since before loss became his constant companion. He woke before dawn as he always had, but now the first sounds he heard weren't the empty creaks of a house settling but the soft breathing of a foal sleeping near the wood stove. Ember had claimed that spot as his own, and Tom had given up trying to move him to more practical locations like the mudroom or the barn. The colt seemed to need the warmth and the proximity to human presence, and Tom found he didn't mind the company as much as he'd expected. Dr. Walsh came every morning for the first week, arriving with the sunrise to check Ember's vitals and administer medications. She brought proper equipment on the second day, a heat lamp that she set up to provide consistent warmth, supplements formulated for orphan foals, bottles and nipples designed for equine use. Tom watched her work and learned by osmosis, absorbing information about feeding schedules and weight monitoring and the dozens of small details that kept a young horse healthy. By the fourth day, he was doing most of the care himself, with Rebecca, as she'd insisted he call her, supervising and offering corrections when needed. The foal's recovery was remarkable in its speed. Within 3 days, Ember was standing on his own, wobbling at first but growing steadier with each attempt. Within a week, he was walking around the living room, exploring with the curiosity that came naturally to young animals, nosing at furniture and knocking over a lamp that fortunately didn't break. Tom found himself rearranging the space to accommodate a growing horse, pushing the couch against the wall, and rolling up the rug that Ember kept tripping over, transforming his living room into something between a barn and a nursery. The stallion remained in the barn, accepting food and shelter but never fully relaxing his vigilance. Tom saw him every time he went out to tend the cattle, the pale gray shape standing at the stall door or pacing the perimeter of the barn interior. The horse never tried to leave, but neither did he settle. He was waiting, Tom understood, waiting to see if his colt would survive, waiting to reclaim what was his. Tom began talking to the stallion during his morning and evening barn chores, keeping up a running commentary about nothing in particular while he forked hay and broke ice from water buckets. The horse's ears would flick toward the sound of his voice, but the animal never approached, maintaining a careful distance that spoke of survival instincts honed over years in the wild. Rebecca noticed the change in Tom before he did. "You're smiling more," she said one morning as she packed up her medical bag. Tom hadn't realized he'd been smiling at all, and the observation made him self-conscious. Ember had just figured out how to scratch his own ears with a hind hoof, an awkward maneuver that had made him lose his balance and sit down hard on his haunches. It had been funny in the way small animals being clumsy was always funny, and Tom supposed his face had reflected that. "The colt's good for you," Rebecca added, not looking at him as she zipped the bag closed. Having something to care about again. Tom didn't know how to respond to that, so he changed the subject, asking about the antibiotic schedule and when they could start weaning Ember off the bottles. Rebecca let him deflect, but the words stayed with him after she left. Was it really that obvious? Had his isolation been so complete that the simple act of keeping a foal alive made him seem like a different person? He looked at Ember, who was nosing around the base of the wood stove in search of dropped grain, and tried to sort out what he was feeling. It wasn't happiness exactly. That seemed too strong a word for the fragile thing growing in his chest. But it was something. Interest maybe. Investment. A reason to get up in the morning beyond just the mechanical continuation of existence. The first real test came on the 8th day when Frank Dalton showed up unannounced. Tom heard the truck before he saw it. The distinctive rumble of Dalton's diesel pickup that everyone in Whitewood County recognized. He went to the window and watched the big red Ford pull into his driveway. Watched Frank climb out wearing his usual uniform of starched jeans, pressed Western shirt, and a hat that probably cost more than Tom's truck. Frank Dalton was everything. Tom wasn't successful and social and the kind of man who believed his money gave him authority over everything in his sphere of influence. Tom had avoided him as much as possible over the years, conducting necessary business through feed store intermediaries and declining invitations to the annual Dalton Ranch barbecue that was more about Frank showing off his wealth than actual hospitality. Now here Frank was on Tom's porch, knocking with the confident rap of someone who expected doors to open for him. Tom considered not answering, but Ember chose that moment to whinny, a sound that carried clearly through the door, and he saw Frank's head turn toward the noise with sharp interest. There was no avoiding this conversation. Tom opened the door but didn't invite Frank inside. "Morning, Frank," Tom said with a neutrality that took effort. "What can I do for you?" Frank's eyes tried to see past Tom into the house, curiosity barely concealed behind a veneer of neighborly concern. "Heard you had some excitement out here," Frank said. "Dr. Walsh mentioned to someone at the feed store that she'd been making house calls to your place. Something about a wild horse." Tom felt his jaw tighten. Rebecca had been discreet, he was sure of that, but in a town of 800 people even careful words found their way into general circulation. "It's true," Tom said, seeing no point in denying what Frank obviously already knew. "A foal needed help. I provided it." Frank's expression shifted into something that probably passed for sympathy in his mind but looked more like calculation to Tom. "Now Tom, you know I've got nothing but respect for animal welfare. But there's laws about wild horses, regulations about keeping them on private property. Bureau of Land Management gets real particular about that sort of thing." Tom crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, deliberately blocking Frank's view into the house. "I'm aware of the laws. Are you here as a concerned neighbor or in some official capacity?" The question made Frank's smile go tight around the edges. "Just being neighborly, making sure you know what you're getting into. Those wild horses are a menace, Tom. They tear up fencing, they spook cattle, they compete with livestock for grazing. Most of us ranchers would be happy to see the herds culled down or removed entirely. If word gets out you're harboring one, feeding it, keeping it on your property, people are going to have opinions." Tom thought about the stallion in his barn, about the scars that told stories of survival against odds most domestic horses never faced. "That horse brought his dying colt to my door asking for help," Tom said quietly. "I wasn't going to turn him away, and what I do on my own land is my business, not the business of people with opinions." Frank's eyes went cold in a way that made Tom glad they were having this conversation in daylight with space between them. "You might want to reconsider that position," Frank said, his voice losing its false friendliness. "There's talk already about organizing a hunt, clearing out the wild horses before they become more of a problem. Would be a shame if someone mistook your horse for part of the wild herd during that hunt." The threat was barely veiled and Tom felt anger ignite in his chest, hot and clean and more alive than he'd felt in years. "You threatening my property, Frank? Because that's what it sounds like. Not threatening, just warning." Frank adjusted his expensive hat and took a step back toward his truck. "You're a smart man, Tom. You'll do the right thing. He climbed into his Ford and drove away, leaving ruts in the snow that looked like scars, and Tom stood on his porch feeling the morning's peace shatter like glass. He went inside and found Ember standing in the middle of the living room, ears pricked toward the door, as if the colt could sense the tension that had invaded the space. Tom ran a hand down the foal's neck, feeling the warm life beneath the soft coat, and made a decision that probably qualified as the most foolish thing he'd done since opening his door to a desperate stallion 10 days ago. He wasn't giving Ember up, wasn't turning him over to the BLM or sending him back to the wild before he was strong enough to survive. And he sure as hell wasn't letting Frank Dalton or anyone else dictate what happened on Brennan land. The decision settled into his bones with the weight of certainty, and with it came the understanding that he'd just committed himself to a fight he might not win. Frank Dalton had money and influence, had the ear of the sheriff and half the county commissioners. Tom had a failing farm and a reputation as a hermit, but he also had something Frank didn't. He had a reason to fight that went beyond money or pride. He had a small creature that trusted him to keep it safe, and he'd learned the hard way that you didn't betray that kind of trust twice. Rebecca arrived an hour later for her daily check, and Tom told her about Frank's visit. She listened with a growing frown, her professional composure cracking to reveal genuine concern. He's serious about organizing a hunt? That's illegal without BLM permits and environmental review. Tom shrugged. Frank's got ways of making things legal after the fact. Money talks in ways that regulations don't. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, checking Ember's temperature with a digital thermometer while she thought. We need to document everything, she said finally. I'll keep detailed medical records showing Ember's condition when he arrived, the treatment provided, his ongoing recovery. If it comes to a legal challenge, we'll have evidence that this was a genuine rescue situation, not someone illegally keeping a wild horse. The word "we" hit Tom like a small shock. He'd been alone for so long that hearing someone volunteer to stand beside him felt foreign and uncomfortable and oddly moving all at once. You don't have to get involved in this, Tom said. Frank's got a long memory for people who cross him. Rebecca looked up from where she was kneeling beside Ember, her gray eyes steady and unyielding. I moved here to start over, she said, to practice medicine without constantly defending my competence. But I didn't move here to stand by and watch good people get bullied by rich ones. I'm involved whether Frank likes it or not. Tom felt something shift in his chest, that wall he'd built around himself developing another crack. He'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone in his corner, to not face every challenge alone. Thank you, he said, and the words carried more weight than 2 syllables should be able to hold. They spent the rest of the morning in companionable work, Rebecca teaching Tom how to check for signs of respiratory infection and Tom showing Rebecca the old search and rescue medical kit he'd kept from his volunteer days. Supplies she said might actually be useful for equine emergencies. They were preparing lunch, Tom making sandwiches while Rebecca filled water buckets. When they heard it, a sound from outside that made them both freeze. Not the wind, which had been constant background noise for days. Not the cattle in the barn. This was something else, a rhythmic pounding that grew louder, accompanied by shouts and the baying of dogs. Tom moved to the window and felt his blood go cold. There were men on his property, 6 of them on horseback with 4 dogs ranging ahead, and they were heading straight for his barn. He recognized 2 of the riders as hands from Dalton Ranch, recognized the aggressive purpose in how they sat their saddles and carried rifles in scabbards on their hips. Tom was moving before conscious thought caught up with his body, grabbing his coat from the hook and his own rifle from the closet. Rebecca caught his arm as he headed for the door. What are you going to do? Stop them, Tom said simply. They're not shooting that horse. Rebecca's face went pale, but she didn't argue. She pulled out her phone, and Tom heard her voice behind him as he stepped outside. Sheriff Mitchell? This is Dr. Rebecca Walsh. I need you at the Brennan farm immediately. There's a situation. The cold hit Tom like always, but he barely felt it. Adrenaline and anger providing their own heat as he strode toward the barn. The riders had pulled up in a loose semicircle around the barn entrance, the dogs whining and circling with their noses to the snow, following some scent Tom couldn't detect. The stallion was visible in the barn doorway, pressed against the back wall of his stall but clearly agitated, ears flat and nostrils flaring. One of the Dalton hands, a man named Pete who Tom had met a few times at the feed store, raised a hand in greeting that was more mockery than friendliness. "Morning, Tom," Pete called out. "Got a report of a wild stallion on your property. Mr. Dalton sent us to take care of the problem." Tom stopped 20 feet from the nearest rider, his rifle held casually across his chest in a way that wasn't quite threatening but wasn't exactly peaceful either. "That horse is on my land and under my protection. I suggest you turn around and head back to wherever you came from." Pete's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now Tom, be reasonable. Wild horses are everybody's problem. We're just doing what needs doing, saving you the trouble." Tom's finger didn't move toward the trigger, but his grip on the rifle shifted slightly, enough to make it clear he knew how to use it. "You're trespassing on private property with weapons. That gives me legal grounds to defend my land. If one of those dogs or any of you cross into my barn, I'll consider it a hostile action." The words were carefully chosen, the language of someone who understood property rights and self-defense law, and Tom saw uncertainty flicker across Pete's face. The other riders shifted in their saddles, clearly not having expected resistance. One of them, younger and probably stupider than Pete, urged his horse forward a few steps. The dogs followed, sensing permission to close in. Tom raised his rifle in a smooth motion that spoke of old training coming back to muscle memory. The barrel pointed at the ground between the young rider and the barn entrance, not aimed at anyone, but the message was unmistakable. "Stop right there." The young hand pulled his horse up short, his own hand moving toward the rifle on his saddle. Tom's voice cut through the tension sharp as breaking ice. "You pull that weapon and this goes from trespassing to assault with a deadly weapon. Ask yourself if Frank Dalton is paying you enough to catch a felony charge." The standoff might have escalated into violence if not for the sound of another vehicle approaching. Tom didn't take his eyes off the riders, but he heard the distinctive rumble of the sheriff's SUV, heard the crunch of tires on snow, and then the slam of a door. Sheriff Mitchell's voice, carrying the authority of 3 decades in law enforcement, said, "What in God's name is happening here?" Tom risked a glance and saw Howard Mitchell standing beside his vehicle, hand resting casually on his service weapon, face set in the expression of a man who'd dealt with too many stupid situations to have patience for one more. Pete turned his horse to face the sheriff, his posture shifting to something more defensive. "Just following orders, Sheriff. Mr. Dalton said there's a wild horse causing problems. Told us to handle it." Mitchell's gaze swept the scene, taking in the armed riders, the dogs, Tom standing with his rifle, the stallion visible in the barn entrance. His expression didn't change, but Tom saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. "Frank Dalton doesn't give orders on Tom Brennan's land," Mitchell said flatly. "And what I see here is 6 armed men trespassing on private property without permission. That's illegal, case you boys forgot." The riders exchanged glances and Tom could see the calculation happening. They'd been sent here expecting easy compliance, maybe a token protest at most. They hadn't expected resistance backed by the law. One by one, they began backing their horses away from the barn, calling in the dogs that whined in protest at being pulled from the hunt. Pete was the last to move, his face tight with anger that had nowhere useful to go. "Mr. Dalton's not going to be happy about this," he said to no one in particular. Mitchell's response was ice. "Mr. Dalton can come talk to me if he's got concerns. Now get off this property before I decide to charge you with something that'll stick." The riders left at a trot that was too fast to be dignified but too slow to look like retreat, kicking up snow in their wake. Tom lowered his rifle and felt the adrenaline start to drain away, leaving him shaky and suddenly aware of how cold he was. Mitchell walked over, his boots crunching in the snow, and stopped a few feet away. "You want to tell me what's really going on here, Tom?" Tom met the sheriff's eyes and saw not hostility but the careful neutrality of someone trying to gather facts before making judgments. He told the story again, from the beginning, Mitchell listening without interrupting. When Tom finished, the sheriff was quiet for a long moment. "That's quite a tale," Mitchell said finally. Rebecca had come out of the house during the confrontation and she stepped forward now, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "Sheriff, I can corroborate everything Tom said. I've been providing veterinary care to the foal since the night it arrived. I have complete medical records documenting its condition and treatment. Mitchell nodded slowly. I believe you, both of you, but belief and law aren't always the same thing. Technically, wild horses fall under BLM jurisdiction. If Frank pushes this, gets federal involvement, it could get complicated. Tom felt that familiar weight settling back onto his shoulders, the sense that doing the right thing was going to cost more than he had to give. What are my options? Mitchell scratched his jaw, thinking. Best thing would be to contact BLM yourself, get ahead of this. Explain the situation, offer to work with them on a solution. If they agree the full needed emergency intervention and you're willing to return it to the wild once it's healthy, they'll probably leave you alone. Frank can make noise, but without federal cooperation he's just hot air. Return him to the wild. The word sat wrong in Tom's chest. Ember was thriving under his care, gaining weight and strength daily. The foal had bonded to him in the way orphaned animals do, following Tom around the house and nickering when he left the room, turning him over to an uncertain future in the high country where winters killed even healthy horses felt like betrayal. But what choice did he have? Sheriff, Tom said slowly, if I agree to work with BLM, can you keep Frank and his men off my property in the meantime? Mitchell nodded. I can and I will. I'll have a word with Frank. Make it clear that sending armed men onto private land crosses a line. You have my word, Tom. That would have to be enough. Tom thanked the sheriff and watched him drive away, then turned to find Rebecca standing close, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. You okay? She asked quietly. Tom realized he was still holding his rifle, his hands tight on the stock, and he forced himself to relax his grip. I haven't pointed a gun at another person in 20 years, he said. Didn't think I'd ever need to again. Rebecca touched his arm briefly. You were protecting something that matters. That's not wrong. They went back inside where Ember was agitated from all the commotion, pacing the living room and calling in high whinnies that spoke of distress. Tom spent the next hour calming him, speaking in low tones and offering the bottle that the foal latched onto eagerly, comfort-sucking even though he wasn't hungry. Rebecca watched from the couch, her usual efficiency replaced by a thoughtful quiet, and when Ember finally settled she said, You're not going to be able to let him go, are you? Tom looked at the foal sleeping against his leg, felt the warm weight of trust that had been placed in his care, and admitted what he'd known since the moment he'd opened his door. No, I'm not. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then pulled out her phone and began scrolling through contacts. I know someone, she said, works for BLM in the Wild Horse and Burro program. She's good people, practical. Let me reach out, see if there's a way to make this legal. Tom felt that crack in his walls widen a little more, felt the dangerous warmth of hope beginning to seep through. You'd do that? Rebecca looked up from her phone and smiled. Tom, I drove through a blizzard at 5 in the morning to save a wild horse's foal. Making a few phone calls is nothing. The rest of the day passed in a strange mixture of tension and normalcy. Rebecca made her calls, stepping outside to have conversations Tom couldn't hear but could read in her body language, the gestures and expressions that shifted between frustration and encouragement. Tom tended to his regular chores, feeding cattle and chickens, checking the generator he kept as backup for the next inevitable power outage, chopping wood for the stove. The stallion was still in the barn when Tom checked, even more agitated than Ember had been, pacing the stall and calling out occasionally with sounds that made Tom's chest ache. The horse knew his colt was in danger, knew that men with guns had come, and every instinct probably screamed at him to take his foal and run. But Ember couldn't run yet, couldn't survive in the wild in his weakened state, and the stallion was trapped by biology and circumstance and the impossible choice he'd made to trust a human. Tom stood at the stall door and spoke to the horse the way he'd been doing for days. Easy boy, it's okay. They're gone. Ember's safe. The stallion's ears flicked toward his voice, but the pacing didn't stop. Tom understood the feeling, that need to move because staying still meant thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. He'd spent 3 years pacing his own mental stalls, wearing paths in his grief that went nowhere and solved nothing. Maybe that's what Ember had done for him, given him something beyond his own loss to focus on. Maybe saving the foal was also saving himself, pulling him out of the endless loop of guilt and regret that had defined his life since Billy and died. Rebecca came back inside as the sun was setting. Her face flushed from cold but eyes bright with something that might have been victory. "My contact at BLM is willing to work with us," she announced. "The official position is that the foal required emergency intervention under the Compassionate Exception Clause. You'll need to apply for a special use permit to keep him temporarily. There'll be inspections and paperwork, but Marissa, that's my contact, thinks we can make a case for long-term placement if you're willing to meet certain conditions." Tom felt his heart kick against his ribs. What conditions? Rebecca pulled out her phone and consulted notes she'd taken. "You'd need to provide documentation of ability to care for the horse, basically proving you have adequate facilities, resources, and knowledge. You'd need to agree to regular veterinary checkups, which I can provide. And you'd need to make a commitment to training and socializing the horse so he can potentially be used for adoption or educational purposes. The BLM doesn't usually allow private individuals to keep wild horses permanently, but there are exceptions for animals that can't be returned to the wild or that serve a public benefit. Educational purposes." Tom turned the phrase over in his mind. He thought about school groups, about kids learning that wild horses were living creatures with intelligence and feelings rather than just problems to be eliminated. He thought about giving talks at the local schools the way some of the search and rescue team members used to do, sharing stories about survival and compassion. He could do that. It would mean opening himself up to public attention he'd avoided for years, would mean letting people back into his carefully isolated world. But for Ember, for the chance to honor the trust that desperate stallion had placed in him, he could do it. "Tell your contact I agree to all of it," Tom said. "Whatever it takes, I'll do it." Rebecca's smile was brilliant, transforming her face from professional to genuinely joyful. "I'll let Marissa know. She'll fast-track the paperwork. In the meantime, just keep doing what you're doing. Keep him healthy, keep him safe, and document everything." Tom nodded and felt something in his chest unclench, a tension he'd been carrying since Frank Dalton's visit finally easing. It wasn't over, not by a long way. There would be inspections and requirements and probably continued hostility from Frank and his supporters. But for the first time since opening his door to an impossible plea, Tom felt like maybe this could actually work. That night after Rebecca left, Tom sat in his living room with Ember sleeping beside his chair and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd committed to. He was going to keep a wild horse, was going to fight the richest man in Whitewood County for the right to do it, was going to open up his private grief fortress to inspections and questions and all the messy complications of community involvement. It was the opposite of everything he'd built for himself over 3 years of careful isolation. And somehow, impossibly, it felt right. He looked down at Ember, at the rise and fall of the foal's breathing, and thought about the stallion still keeping vigil in the barn. 2 wild creatures who'd chosen to trust him when they had no reason to, when all their instincts probably screamed the opposite. How could he betray that trust by choosing the safe path, by giving up when things got difficult? He couldn't. That was the truth of it. Tom Brennan, who'd failed to save his son, who'd watched his wife die by degrees, who'd hidden from life because life hurt too much, that man had been given an unexpected chance at redemption. A chance to keep a promise, to protect something fragile, to prove that not all trust was misplaced and not all hope was futile. He was going to take it, was going to face down Frank Dalton and the BLM and anyone else who tried to come between him and the impossible miracle sleeping on his floor. Because maybe that's what healing looked like. Not forgetting the pain or pretending it never happened, but finding new reasons to care despite knowing how much caring could cost. Tom reached down and rested his hand on Ember's shoulder, feeling the warmth and life beneath the soft coat. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding him that winter in Wyoming was far from over. But inside his house it was warm, and there was a foal breathing steady beside him, and somewhere in his barn a wild stallion stood watch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new complications, new reasons to question his sanity. But tonight, in this moment, Tom Brennan felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. And that, he thought as sleep finally began to pull him down, that was enough. The paperwork arrived 3 days later in a thick manila envelope bearing the Bureau of Land Management logo. Tom spread the documents across his kitchen table and felt the familiar weight of bureaucracy settling onto his shoulders. There were forms requesting detailed information about his property, his income, his experience with horses, his long-term plans. There were liability waivers and compliance agreements and a 10-page document outlining the responsibilities of special use permit holders. Tom read through it all twice, making notes in the margins, and by the time he finished his coffee had gone cold and his head was pounding. Rebecca came by that afternoon as she'd been doing daily, ostensibly to check on Ember, but really, Tom suspected, because she'd become invested in this whole situation in ways that went beyond professional obligation. She found him still at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, and without asking went to make fresh coffee. "You look like you're trying to decode ancient hieroglyphics," she said, setting a steaming mug in front of him. Tom gestured at the spread of documents. "Might as well be. Half of this I understand, the other half reads like it was written specifically to confuse people." Rebecca pulled out a chair and sat down, scanning the nearest form. "Want help?" They spent the next 2 hours working through the application together, Rebecca translating bureaucratic language into plain English and Tom filling in answers that he hoped would satisfy whoever reviewed this. The process was tedious, but having company made it bearable. And Tom found himself grateful once again for this woman who'd inserted herself into his crisis without invitation but also without judgment. When they finally finished, the stack of completed forms looked substantial enough to impress, and Rebecca volunteered to drive them into town to overnight them to the BLM office in Cheyenne. Ember had been watching their work from his spot by the wood stove, and when Rebecca stood to leave the foal, scrambled to his feet and followed her to the door. He'd been doing that lately, tracking the humans in his life with increasing confidence. His legs steadier every day and his personality beginning to emerge from beneath the trauma of near death. Tom watched the colt nose at Rebecca's coat pocket, searching for the treats she'd started bringing, and felt a complicated mix of pride and concern. Ember was bonding to people, learning to see humans as sources of food and comfort rather than threats. That was good for his immediate survival, but Tom worried about what it meant long-term. A horse too comfortable with people was a horse that might approach the wrong human, someone like Frank Dalton who saw wild horses as problems to be eliminated. The thought of Frank brought Tom's mind back to the confrontation 3 days ago, the armed riders and the dogs, and the very real possibility of violence. Sheriff Mitchell had been true to his word, Tom knew, because 2 different people at the feed store had mentioned that Frank was complaining about the sheriff overstepping his authority. But complaining wasn't the same as backing down, and Tom had lived in rural Wyoming long enough to know that men like Frank Dalton didn't forget slights or forgive opposition. There would be another move, another attempt to force Tom's hand, and he needed to be ready for it. That readiness took the form of preparation, both practical and legal. Tom spent the following week reinforcing his barn, replacing rotted boards and securing latches that had grown loose over years of neglect. He inventoried his feed supplies and placed a large order that made the clerk at the co-op raise her eyebrows but process without comment. He pulled his old search and rescue manuals from the basement and reviewed sections on emergency animal care, refreshing knowledge that had gone dusty from disuse. And he contacted the one lawyer he knew in Riverside, a woman named Patricia Chun who handled mostly property disputes and estate planning, but who Tom hoped could advise him on his legal position. Patricia came out to the farm on a Saturday, driving a sensible sedan that looked out of place among the trucks and tractors that usually occupied Tom's driveway. She was in her mid-50s, sharp-eyed and direct in a way Tom appreciated, and she listened to his story without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her fingers steepled beneath her chin in an attitude of thought. "You've put yourself in an interesting position," she said finally. "The law on wild horses is complicated, federal jurisdiction overlapping with state and local regulations. But if BLM grants you the permit, that gives you significant legal protection. Frank Dalton can complain all he wants, but he can't override federal authority." The words should have been comforting, but Patricia's expression suggested there was more. However, she continued, "Permits can be revoked if you violate terms, or if circumstances change. Frank's wealthy and well-connected. If he wants to make trouble, he can file complaints, request investigations, pressure his friends in government to look for any violation they can find. You'll need to be absolutely meticulous about following every requirement, keeping every record, dotting every I and crossing every T. One mistake could give them grounds to pull the permit and seize the horse. Tom felt his jaw tighten. So I have to be perfect. Patricia's smile was sympathetic but realistic. Welcome to dealing with government agencies while having enemies with resources. Yes, you have to be perfect. She left him with a retainer agreement and a promise to review any official correspondence before he responded. And Tom added her fee to the growing list of expenses this rescue was costing him. The farm wasn't profitable even in good years, and this definitely wasn't a good year. Between Rebecca's veterinary services, the extra feed, Patricia's legal advice, and the general costs of caring for a growing horse, Tom was watching his savings account shrink at an alarming rate. But every time he considered the financial burden, he'd look at Ember and remember why he'd chosen this path. Some things mattered more than money. Some promises were worth keeping regardless of cost. The stallion remained a constant presence in the barn, still wild but no longer quite as unapproachable. Tom had been working with him in small ways, never pushing, never demanding, just existing in the horse's space until his presence became familiar rather than threatening. He'd started leaving treats in the stall, sweet feed mixed with molasses that the stallion would eat only after Tom left but that disappeared reliably every day. He'd begun grooming sessions where he'd work on the cattle in the adjacent stall while talking to the pale horse, letting his voice become part of the environment. Progress was measured in millimeters, a horse that no longer pinned his ears quite so aggressively, that watched Tom's movements with calculation rather than pure fight or flight instinct. Rebecca noticed the change during one of her visits. He's gentling, she observed, watching the stallion from a safe distance. That's remarkable for a completely wild horse. Tom leaned against the stall door, careful not to make direct eye contact with the animal. I think he was domestic once, a long time ago. Something about the way he responds to voice, the way he tolerates proximity. A true wild horse wouldn't adapt this quickly. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. That would make sense. There are stories about ranch horses that escaped or were turned loose during bad winters. Horses that went feral and passed that wildness to their offspring. But somewhere in the bloodline there's memory of humans being something other than predators. The conversation reminded Tom of something he'd been meaning to ask. What happens to the stallion after Ember's grown? He can't stay in my barn forever, and I can't imagine he'd want to. Rebecca's expression grew troubled. That's complicated. Technically, he's a wild horse on private property, which means he should be reported to BLM. But given that he brought Ember here, given the unique circumstances, there might be room for flexibility. We could argue that he's part of the rescue situation, that separating him from the foal would cause distress to both animals. It's not standard protocol, but this whole situation isn't standard. Tom thought about the stallion standing vigil through that first night, thought about the trust implicit in leaving his colt with a human stranger, and knew he couldn't betray that by having the horse rounded up and sent to a holding facility. We'll figure it out, Tom said with more confidence than he felt. One crisis at a time. The immediate crisis arrived 2 weeks later in the form of a phone call from a BLM inspector named Douglas Wright, who informed Tom he'd be conducting the site visit required for permit approval. Wright would arrive the following Tuesday, would inspect the facilities and interview Tom about his qualifications and intentions, and would make a recommendation to the regional office about whether to grant the special use permit. Tom spent the days before the inspection in a frenzy of preparation that reminded him of how his house used to look when and was expecting company. He cleaned the barn until it gleamed, organized his tack room, repaired the last of the loose boards in the fence line. He printed out all his documentation and arranged it in a binder with labeled tabs, creating a paper trail that showed every aspect of Ember's care from the night of his arrival to the present. He even cleaned his house, a task he'd been neglecting for months, because Wright would presumably want to see where the foal was currently living. Rebecca came over the night before the inspection to help Tom rehearse answers to likely questions. She played the role of skeptical bureaucrat while Tom explained his background, his facilities, his commitment to Ember's welfare. They went through it 3 times, Rebecca pushing harder each round, until Tom felt as prepared as he was going to get. "You'll do fine," Rebecca assured him as she gathered her things to leave. Just be honest, be thorough, and remember that you saved this foal's life. That counts for something. Tom wanted to believe her, but years of dealing with government agencies during his search and rescue work had taught him that good intentions didn't always translate to positive outcomes. Douglas Wright arrived precisely on time Tuesday morning, driving a white BLM truck and carrying a clipboard that looked well used. He was younger than Tom expected, maybe 40, with the weathered face of someone who spent most of his time outdoors and the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned not to form opinions before gathering facts. Tom met him at the door and they shook hands, Wright's grip firm but not aggressive, and then the inspection began. Wright started with the barn, walking through slowly and taking notes. He checked the stalls, the feed storage, the water system, asking questions about capacity and maintenance schedules. He examined the fencing, testing posts for stability, measuring the height and spacing of rails. He was thorough in a way that made Tom nervous, finding small deficiencies that Tom rushed to explain or promised to fix. When Wright finally turned his attention to the stallion still occupying the largest stall, his expression shifted slightly into something that might have been surprise. "That's the sire?" Wright asked, and Tom confirmed it was. Wright moved closer to the stall, studying the pale gray horse with an intensity that suggested professional interest beyond just inspection requirements. "How long has he been here?" "Since the night he brought the foal," Tom said. 3 weeks now. He won't leave while Ember's here, won't go back to the wild without his colt." Wright made a note on his clipboard, but his attention remained on the stallion. "That's unusual behavior for a wild horse. Has he shown any aggression toward you or Dr. Walsh?" Tom shook his head. "Defensive posturing at first, but no actual aggression. He accepts food and tolerates my presence in the barn. I've been working on desensitization, just existing in his space, and he's adapting." Wright circled the stall, observing the stallion from multiple angles, and Tom couldn't read his expression well enough to know if this was going to count in his favor or against him. "Let's see the foal," Wright said finally, and they headed back to the house. Ember was in the living room where Tom had left him, and the colt looked up at their entrance with bright, curious eyes. Wright spent a long time examining the foal, running his hands over legs and body, checking teeth and hooves, asking detailed questions about diet and growth rate. Rebecca had prepared Tom well, and he answered each question with specifics, citing weights and measurements and medication schedules. Wright consulted the medical records Tom provided, comparing them against what he was seeing, and Tom held his breath waiting for criticism that would torpedo the whole application. Instead, Wright sat back on his heels and said, "Dr. Walsh has been thorough. The care this animal has received is above what most domestic horses get, much less wild ones." Tom felt something in his chest ease slightly. When Wright finally stood and closed his clipboard, Tom couldn't contain the question any longer. "What's your assessment? Will you recommend approval?" Wright's expression gave nothing away. "I need to write up my report and submit it to the regional office. They'll make the final decision. But I will say this, Mr. Brennan. What you did that night, taking in a dying foal brought to you by a desperate stallion, that took courage and compassion. The fact that you've followed through with proper care, that you're willing to navigate bureaucracy and expense to do right by this animal, that speaks to character. Those things will be in my report." It wasn't a guarantee, but it was closer to approval than Tom had dared hope for. Wright left with a promise to have his recommendation submitted within a week, and Tom stood on his porch watching the BLM truck disappear down his driveway. He felt wrung out, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with emotional strain. Ember nickered from inside the house, and Tom went back in to find the foal waiting by the door, clearly wanting to go outside. Tom had been letting him out for short supervised periods lately, letting Ember explore the immediate area around the house under careful watch, and the colt had come to associate the sound of the door closing as the signal for adventure. They went out together, Tom bundled in his heavy coat and Ember prancing through snow that came up to his knees. The foal was growing stronger every day, his movements more coordinated, his confidence building. He investigated everything, nosing at the woodpile and the truck and the fence posts, learning his environment the way young creatures do. Tom kept close, not wanting Ember to wander out of sight, and found himself smiling at the colt's antics despite the stress of the morning. This, he thought, This was why he'd fought so hard. For moments like this, watching a creature that should have died instead discovering life with joy and curiosity. The stallion was watching from the barn. Tom noticed. The pale gray head visible in the opening, amber eyes tracking Ember's every move. Tom wondered what the horse was thinking. If he understood that his colt was safe and thriving, or if he only knew that they remained separated. On impulse, Tom led Ember toward the barn, curious how the two would interact after weeks apart. The foal picked up his pace when he saw his sire, calling out in high whinnies that the stallion answered with deep rumbles Tom felt in his chest. They met at the barn entrance, father and son, and Tom stayed back to watch. The stallion lowered his head and blew softly across Ember's face, scenting him, checking for signs of harm. Ember leaned into the contact, clearly remembering the bond even after weeks of separation. They stood like that for several minutes, reconnecting in the wordless language of horses, and Tom felt his throat go tight. This was what he'd been trying to preserve, this relationship, this proof that wild things could love fiercely and sacrificially. Eventually Ember pulled away, distracted by something in the snow, and the stallion's gaze moved to Tom. Man and horse regarded each other across 10 feet of cold air, and Tom saw something in those amber eyes that might have been acknowledgement. "You trusted me," Tom said quietly. "I'm trying to honor that." Whether the horse understood the words or just the tone, Tom couldn't say, but the stallion didn't move away when Tom took a careful step closer. Progress, slow as snow melting, but progress nonetheless. The approval came through 6 days later, a letter from the BLM regional office granting Tom a 1-year special use permit for the care and custody of one wild horse foal pending annual review and continued compliance with specified conditions. Tom read the letter 3 times to make sure he'd understood it correctly, then called Rebecca to share the news. She whooped so loudly he had to hold the phone away from his ear, and she promised to come over that evening to celebrate. Tom spent the afternoon in a daze of relief and renewed purpose. He'd done it. Against the odds, against Frank Dalton's opposition, against his own doubts, he'd managed to make this legal and official. Ember was his responsibility now, his to care for and protect, and that felt both terrifying and exactly right. Rebecca arrived with a bottle of wine and a bakery cake that said congratulations in blue frosting, which she must have driven all the way to Casper to get because Riverside didn't have a bakery. They sat at Tom's kitchen table, the first time he'd shared a meal with another person in his house since and died, and talked about next steps. Rebecca had heard from her BLM contact that Douglas Wright's report had been glowing, that he'd specifically mentioned Tom's dedication and the exceptional level of care Ember had received. That recommendation had apparently carried significant weight in the approval decision. Tom felt gratitude toward Wright, a man who could have easily found reasons to deny the permit but who'd chosen to see the situation with compassion rather than just by-the-book regulation. They talked late into the evening, conversation ranging from logistics of Ember's continued care to speculation about Frank Dalton's next move to carefully personal questions about their pasts and the wounds they'd both come to Wyoming to heal. Tom found himself telling Rebecca things he hadn't spoken aloud in years, memories of Billy, and in that hurt but also felt necessary to share, as if keeping them locked away had been part of what kept him locked away too. Rebecca reciprocated with her own stories, the malpractice suit that had nearly destroyed her, the loneliness of being seen as suspect rather than skilled, the slow rebuilding of confidence that had brought her to Riverside. By the time she left, well after midnight, Tom felt like he'd crossed some threshold he hadn't known existed. He'd let someone in, not all the way maybe but far enough that the walls around his heart had become something more like fences. Boundaries still, but ones you could see through and climb over rather than impenetrable barriers. He cleaned up the plates and cake remnants, moving through his kitchen with a lightness he hadn't felt in years, and checked on Ember one last time before bed. The foal was sleeping peacefully, his breathing deep and even, completely at ease in his strange domestic life. Tom stood watching him for a long moment, committing the scene to memory. Whatever came next, whatever challenges Frank Dalton or bureaucracy or fate itself threw at him, he had this. A wild horse sleeping safe in his house, a father keeping vigil in his barn, and the fragile but growing belief that maybe healing wasn't about forgetting pain, but about finding new reasons to care despite it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.